Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Facts and Fallacies podcast. This is episode 219. I am your host, Cameron English, joined again by Dr. Liza Dunn, filling in for Dr. Kevin Folta while he is off learning to be a dad. Liza, so good to see you again. How are things?
Things are great. It's good to be back. I was at EPA this week, which was really interesting.
Yeah. I've heard exciting things about meetings at the EPA. I'm sure it was quite the party.
It was.
All right. Well, let's jump right into our stories for the week. All good stuff. There's a few things in here that are a little bit unorthodox for us, but I think they're still worth diving into. So let's jump into these. So first up, a very familiar topic, of course, glyphosate fact check. Micro traces in food do not constitute a dangerously high amount of weed killer. Next up, Snopes fact checks claims by deep state conspiracy grifters that U.S. government adds COVID vaccines into our food supply. And finally, marijuana and psychosis, cannabis use linked to 30% of diagnoses in young men. This is always very intriguing, talking about drugs. Okay, yeah. But let's talk about this first one. Well-worn subject for both of us, especially for you. But I think it's important to cover this because it continues to come up on social media and even in the press quite frequently. It's the same topics over and over. So as long as this is getting attention, I think it's probably important for us to push back on it. I'm sure you would agree with that. And sure. Here specifically, we're talking about a story from PolitiFact. This is by just their fact checkers, and they're responding to a Facebook reel that alleged that Goldfish crackers contain dangerous amounts of glyphosate. And this is particularly important, at least to me, because I'm a new dad. So I'm right in the range of, my kids eat, or my kid, eats goldfish, right? It's a real common snack. I even eat goldfish. They're delicious, right? So it's not just that they're saying this causes cancer, it's that they're targeting it at parents of young children. And this irritates me to no end. So there's not much else to set up the story with, except this was a goofy claim on Facebook. And, there's a few specifics we can get into, but just take it away here. This is right up your alley.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. People always talk about being concerned about finding trace levels of a variety of different pesticides in their food products. But you can rest assured that this is actually very, very well studied, and it's actually regulated by the USDA and the FDA, and the EPA, to make sure that there isn't a level that raises any concern for the food supply. And the fact is, we have the safest food supply in the history of mankind because of the repeated testing that organizations like the EPA and the USDA do. So how do we make sure that you don't get overexposed to chemicals in your food? Well, first and foremost, the vast majority of the pesticides that we eat come from plants that defend themselves naturally. They're natural chemicals that plants make to prevent them from harm from other organisms like infectious organisms or insects or things like that. Remember, plants can't run away from you, so they make their own internal chemicals to defend themselves. And those are found in much higher concentrations than any synthetic chemical that you will find in trace amounts on a plant. Now, when you ingest those things, they will not result in harm, right? Because they're so heavily regulated. So when farmers apply different pesticides to their crops, there's a maximum amount that they're allowed to use. And that is enforced. And when there's continual testing through various stages in the processing of food to make sure that the residues don't exceed a certain number. And that number is not a number that means that there's a safety problem if they test and they find a residue that's higher than the cutoff. That doesn't mean that there is a health effect associated with it. That means that you can't put that commodity on the market because it's too high. So they won't even let it get into the food supply in the first place. So that's how rigorous the situation is about testing. Now, what they're doing is they're giving a limit, a maximum residue limit that you're allowed to have on a crop. And then what the EPA does is it takes all of the other possible routes of exposure, air, water, other products like fruits and vegetables and things like that, and makes a maximum exposure level that you or your child will be exposed to. And that maximum exposure level is thousands and thousands of times lower than what they bill as the allowable daily intake. And the allowable daily intake is the maximum amount that you are allowed to take. And it is the non-toxic dose in animals divided by 100 or 1,000. So it's by default a non-toxic dose. So it's not going to harm you to get little tiny bits of residues. And you can trust that these are tested and monitored to make sure that you aren't going to get the allowable you actually can't physically get to the allowable daily intake. It's too high of a number, meaning that you would have to eat thousands and thousands and thousands of goldfish all day long, every day, to get to the allowable daily intake. And you'd probably die of goldfish toxicity before you could ever even get to that level. So you can be reassured that people take this very seriously and monitor it.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, that sounds like a fun experiment. Maybe like the first quarter of it would be fun, just like fistfuls of goldfish.
That's like power eating.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe you could, as our third story entails, enjoy some marijuana and then see how much. Okay. Yeah. Don't stuff yourself with goldfish. That's not a good idea. I'm joking.
No.
In all seriousness, this is from a 2021 review of all of the literature on glyphosate exposure through food. Like just this narrow topic, there's been, I want to say, hundreds of studies looking at the various aspects of this. And if you're having trouble falling asleep, I'll send you a link to this, I promise. So, and no disrespect to the authors, it's really dry scientific information. But they write here, the US FDA and the European Food Safety Authority in Europe compile yearly monitoring reports of pesticides using validated tests that are capable of measuring multiple pesticide residues to understand the average concentrations, validation limits of the assays, and percent of the samples that have detectable residue levels. So sometimes the activist groups will say, okay, yeah, the EPA looked at this when they approved it, but they're not testing it now, so we have no idea how much of this chemical you're exposed to. That's nonsense. We have data from multiple studies, from multiple years, from multiple countries, right? That we know how much of this is in our food. And as Liza was just saying, the threshold that is allowed is artificially conservative. They do that on purpose. So, yeah, go ahead. Keep going. This is good
so, yeah, you don't have to worry about it. So once again, our food supply is very, very heavily regulated, very well monitored, tested all the time to make sure that there aren't toxins that are going to cause harm in your food. Now, think about it. If you don't use pesticides, you can actually introduce toxins from natural sources. So, for example, one of the most potent toxins known to mankind is aflatoxin. And if you have a crop that gets infested with insects, and those insects carry fungi on their coats and introduce that fungal infection to the crop, they can elaborate mycotoxins that actually really can have a huge impact on very large groups of people and huge populations. So you can have big outbreaks that involve hundreds of people. Same thing with if you don't have, herbicides, you wind up getting contaminations with toxic weeds, and toxic weeds in the food supply can cause a lot of problems. Abraham Lincoln's mother actually died from white snake root poisoning. So it's milk poisoning, and that's a weed that contaminates crops and food that cattle eat when they're grazing, and it concentrates a chemical called trematol in their milk. And when they drink that milk, it causes a terrible syndrome, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, seizures, and muscle spasms until you die. And that's how Mrs. Lincoln died. So it's really important that we have good weed control to protect our food supply from toxic contaminations and things like that. So without using, modern tools that we've used for modern agriculture, you can get those residues in your food supply. And remember, we've had 10,000 years of experience with organic farming and 50 years of food security in the West. And that's because of these scientific advances. And glyphosate is actually a cornerstone of those advances. It's it is probably the most important chemistry in all of agriculture because of its very low toxicity profile, and it's environmentally friendly, and it's a really important tool. And trace exposures that are like a drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, if not less, are not going to harm you.
Yeah, it's a really important point. I think sometimes people get the idea that farmers just use these for fun or because, like there's some small economic benefit to spraying this stuff on their crops. That's not true, right? There's real reasons for controlling weeds, to protect our food. And really quick, I misquoted that study earlier. I want to make sure I get this quote right since I'm being so critical. So they write global regulatory authorities such as the FDA, EPA, and the European Food Safety Authority have required extensive data both prior to and often after commercialization of pesticides, such as glyphosate. Just to be clear on their wording.
And go ahead. On how much is actually used on a field, right? So if you look at, you hear often these wild amounts, in the literature. There are hundreds of thousands of pounds of glyphosate being used across acres. Well, so what's a pound? 16 ounces, right? And so if you think about that's a little bit more than a Coca-Cola diluted in gallons of water, right? Spread out over an area that's the size of a football field. So it's very, very small amount that's being put on. Farmers aren't dousing their crops. They don't want to waste chemical and they don't want to exceed the tolerances because they can't sell their crop. So they're very, very careful about how and when they apply various different pesticides.
Yeah, I always get a kick out of, you consume X amount of pounds of this, like when they do that with sugar, sometimes they're like, here's all the sugar you've eaten in your life. Like, that's not helpful. That doesn't tell me anything about my health risk from eating sugar or anything. So I think you can generally just discount those kinds of analyses, right? You need to know, like, what's the dose that's harmful? How much are you getting at a particular setting or over a set period of time? Just to say that farmers use however many millions of pounds of this, it's not a really valid measurement. It doesn't make any sense.
No, but it sounds very scary. So that's why they use it. That's why they use it. And remember, in toxicology, the dose makes the poison, right? So if you've got a non-toxic dose, you're not going to get sick.
Yeah. A couple other facts to throw in here. Again, I'd love your input on these. First is that glyphosate is primarily it's degraded by soil microbes. So after it's sprayed on crops, it's degraded. It doesn't bioaccumulate in the food chain. So the assumption made in a lot of these claims that you see on social media is that they just keep spraying it and we get exposed to increasing amounts of it in our food. That's not true. That's why there's only traces of it in our food, is because it's degraded before it gets to your table or to your pantry or what have you. And also, this is critical too, the IARC analysis, the monograph that everybody relies on, as flawed as it is, it does not look at your exposure through food. They said that there was, I think, limited evidence of a cancer hazard for agricultural workers. That is, people with the highest exposure. Now, we've talked before about why that's flawed, but I think it's important here that people are citing this monograph without even realizing it doesn't pertain to the claims that they're making.
No, it certainly doesn't. Yes, and that's exactly right. There is no evidence that anything like first of all, it does not cause cancer, just period. And I think not enough people hear that. They hear get anxious about it. They don't hear that it really doesn't cause cancer.
Yes, absolutely. Here's a helpful illustration. This is sort of along the lines of you'd have to eat however many pounds of goldfish, but this is William Reeves, who was at Monsanto when he gave this quote to USA Today. I don't know if he's still at Bayer.
Yes.
Okay. So he said in 2019, assuming the greatest value reported, and he's talking about a study by Environmental Working Group that they had they had put out at the time. So he says, assuming the greatest value reported, which is 51.4 parts per billion, is correct, a 125-pound adult would have to consume 308 gallons of wine per day, every day for life, to reach the EPA's glyphosate exposure limit for humans. Now, obviously, you can't drink that much wine. If you could, though, you die of alcohol poisoning long before glyphosate could even give you a stomach ache. So, just to put these things in context.
And remember, ethanol, which is the active ingredient in wine that gives you the kind of flushed feeling, is a class 1 carcinogen.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And you'll often see at fundraising events and receptions and so forth, you'll see these activists with cocktails in their hands as they're talking about the dangers of glyphosate.
Exactly.
Okay, we can move on. Like I said, we've talked about it a lot. There's no point in belaboring it, but just look this stuff up. I'll put a link to this review that I'm pulling from. I mean, you have to know this stuff. Share it with your friends. Don't worry about eating goldfish. Nothing's going to happen unless you eat, way too many. Okay.
Right. All right. Moderation and everything.
There you go. They, the Greeks had it, 2,500 years ago. They figured that out. Okay. So next up, we have Snopes fact checks claim by deep state conspiracy grifters. I love that phrase, that U.S. government adds COVID vaccines into our food supply. We talked about this not long before Kevin went off on a paternity leave, we'll call it. But there's two primary theories here. The first is that you have livestock farmers injecting their animals with mRNA COVID vaccines, and then I'm sorry, it's such a silly idea, but the basic premise seems to be that the immune response that the animals have survives slaughter, it survives transportation, it survives cooking, and by the time you eat your steak or your hamburger or whatever, then you're
vaccinated.
Right. So we talked about that. If you have any thoughts, I'd be glad to hear them. But it's just it's silly, right? And the reason, and Kevin talked about this, mRNA is a very unstable molecule. It's not going to survive all of that. This is not our speculation. This is pretty easy to verify.
That's great.
The one I wanted to focus on, and again, if you have thoughts on that, I want to hear them, but they're making claims about edible vaccines and so forth, which hasn't been addressed as much. But before we get on to that, do you have any thoughts about this? Animals are carrying COVID vaccine?
No, animals are, that I think that people are once again, it shows you the level of panic that's out there in the population. And I think that is unfortunate because really mRNA vaccines are not going to survive any kind. They're not, if you inject an animal with an mRNA vaccine, and I'm not actually aware of anything that's actually happening with them. I take that back. There is research being done on some pretty interesting mRNA vaccines that being thought about use in pigs, for example, for diseases like PRRS, which is really, really hard to treat and has a high fatality rate. But it's, as far as I understand, and once again, I'm not a veterinarian, but as far as I understand, there is not widespread use of mRNA vaccines of any type in livestock. Now, that said, if there were to be, it would be used for very, very difficult to treat diseases to try to prevent animals from getting deadly diseases, right? And the vaccine itself is going to be injected in the animal, and just to be active locally is where it's going to elicit the immune response. It's not going to migrate anywhere because, once again, mRNA is very, very, very fragile, right? So you're not going to get this sort of factory-like production of multiple antibodies that then gets transmitted through the food supply to people. So people are understandably concerned given the misinformation about mRNA vaccines, but your once again, your food supply is very safe.
Here's a quote. This is from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. They actually directly address this because, this is a real serious, potentially serious threat to their industry. So they came out and they said there are no current mRNA vaccines licensed for use in beef cattle in the United States. Cattle farmers and ranchers do vaccinate cattle to treat and prevent many diseases, but presently none of these vaccines include mRNA technology.
Right.
So that's very important. And just this is just sort of a side note, but people that work in agriculture tend to lean a little bit to the right. That's at least my experience.
Absolutely.
So they don't have an incentive here to stick up for the FDA or to stick up for the federal government. Like if there was something off here, I think these folks would be the first to go, why are you trying to make us put this in our food or put you know what I mean? Like,
that's exactly right. Because they're the ones that are actually concerned about the vaccines. Right. So,
right.
And I do. And that's part of my outreach is to try to explain how the vaccines work to this group of people. And then explain to physicians why people have concerns about the vaccine. And I do a talk, and I may have mentioned this before, called How Medicine Became Monsanto, COVID-19 and Pitfalls in Scientific Communication. And I try to take two groups, farmers and rural people who are growers and producers who tend to be more conservative, and have them talk directly with physicians and public health people who tend to be more urban and liberal. And in order to try to find some common middle ground, I think we've kind of lost sight of the fact that we all eventually want the same things. We want our kids to be healthy. We want a healthy food supply. And we really, really have the same goals. So we've just got to figure out how to get ourselves back into the middle.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I wish we could keep things apolitical in science. It seems to be that we just can't. It's increasingly difficult, But I think that's the obvious answer here is to say, look, let me give you the facts. Do with them what you will, but I'm not here to force an agenda. Let me just explain how the science works. I think that's the best way forward.
And, I'm from big ag, but I have kids, I have family, and so I want the same thing for my kids.
Yeah, everybody does. I think it's easy to forget that, especially online. It's a cliche to say it, but, when you meet people in person that you talk to online, it just changes everything, so I would just keep that in mind. The other angle, or I guess prong of attack that you'll get when you hear this or that you hear this theory is that government scientists are engineering plants that contain the vaccine. So they're going to stealthily vaccinate you with a tomato or something. And the common example, I think the one used in this post was Medicago's COVID vaccine. And we talked about this a couple episodes ago. Medicago's vaccine was grown in plants. It's an example of biofarming like we were talking about. But it's not an edible vaccine, right? So the active ingredient, virus-like particles, are grown in the plants, and then they're purified and they're put into a shot that you would normally get. And it more or less, it's not mRNA, but it more or less works the same way. It was a 2-dose vaccine series. But it's not edible. And one other thing before you jump back in here is that Canada approved the vaccine, but it was in like March 2022. So by that point, the vast majority of Canadians had been vaccinated. So very few people got this. And then, as we also said a couple of weeks ago, the World Health Organization refused to license it because Medicago has Philip Morris as an investor, or at least they did at the time. And so that was a big no-no. So there's people that need this vaccine, but dirty tobacco money and so forth.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's tragic. I could go on for hours about how ridiculous that is. But yeah, so those two things are important. It's not an edible vaccine, and very few people have gotten it. So it's not a good example to use for the government's, sneaking shots to people. But what are your thoughts?
Okay. Yeah, no, I get it. That's exactly right. And the trouble with a lot of the idea of an edible vaccine is that your digestive system breaks down proteins. Mm-hmm. So it makes it very difficult to design something that would go through the acid environment in your stomach and the basic environment in your gut in various different enzymes, which are geared to break down proteins. So vaccinating by mouth, polio is a little bit different, but that's a hard sort of pharmacologic feat to accomplish. So that's why most vaccines are given intramuscularly.
Yes. And we should say, there is research on edible vaccines. It's at a very preliminary stage. You're not going to walk into a grocery store and pick up a head of lettuce and it's going to have, your flu vaccine in it. That's, as far as I know, That's not coming for a long time, if it is ever coming. There are some more advanced projects to produce pharmaceuticals in, say, a tomato or say a head of lettuce. Like there's one that was developed in the UK recently where they engineered a tomato to produce L-Dopa, which is used to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's, which is really cool. But you're not supposed to just eat the tomatoes on a salad. It's so they can harvest the tomatoes and then extract the L-Dopa, right?
It's just That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And remember, I mean, once again, L-Dopa is kind of interesting because it can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. But the problem with eating plain old dopamine is that you can't. It can't get across there. So you've got to sort of engineer a lot of things to be able to make a bioavailable pharmaceutical that will go to the place that it's supposed to go to treat things. It's very difficult to do. Very difficult to do.
Yeah. And just a final point before we move on, there is real value in developing these products. So whether they're edible or not, producing vaccines or pharmaceuticals and food, the idea is you make drugs cheaper for people, right? So you increase the access to medicine.
That's exactly right. And if you can do it in a environmentally friendly way, use the sun as your energy source and, water and things like that, that's absolutely wonderful way of cutting down on the costs it takes for bricks and mortar and electricity and things like that. So, yeah. And if you remember also, lots of people are very interested in taking supplements, that they buy from, unregulated sources. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of those supplements, we don't know how they're manufactured, but they come from plants, right? And many of our pharmaceuticals come from plants too. Remember, mm-hmm. we said earlier, plants can't run away from you, so they make all sorts of substances. Some of them have very good pharmaceutical use. I mean, you think about aspirin, which came from salicylate, right? So, you think about different anti-malarial medicines like quinine, coming from different trees and things like that. So plants make pharmaceutical compounds. They make other compounds that have toxicities. They make all sorts of, things, bioactive things, and it takes different concentrations for them to have a actual biologic effect.
Yeah, we tend to forget how useful they are for medicinal purposes, unless we're talking about alternative health, right? The one aspect where it doesn't do anything, that's where we're okay. We tend to forget the usefulness of plants in this context because we have widespread access to vitamins, right? Like there's vitamins in your food, of course, but there's supplements. And you know what I mean? Like you're not sick because you have access to all this stuff. So a conspiracy theory.
And your food is fortified as well.
Right. Yeah. Breakfast cereals, all kinds of foods are fortified because a lot of people don't eat the balanced diet that they need, but they have access to it nonetheless. Now, in a lot of places, this isn't the case. So we can overlook the fact that this is useful in, say, the Philippines or Bangladesh, right? As we talked about with golden rice. There's value in this, but because we're here and we're healthy, this sort of a conspiracy seems like the only reason the government anywhere would want this. And that's not correct. So we just need to broaden our horizons a little bit, I suppose.
That's right.
Okay. So yeah, leave that there. By the way, just before we move on, I went to a concert recently. I was talking with a friend of mine who was very, very angry about the vaccine mandates and the mask mandates. And I was like, and I share a lot of those concerns. I thought that those were largely unjustified. But he went into this, they're putting the vaccines in the food thing. And I just said, hey, look, man, that's actually not correct. Here's, 3 things. And it's all stuff we've talked about. And he just kind of sat back and went, that makes sense. That's interesting, right? So even if I didn't change his mind entirely, I planted those seeds of, here's some common sense stuff. So the next time he sees that on Facebook or whatever, right, that's going to be
wrong. Question about it, the validity of it.
Yeah.
And once again, the science behind the vaccine is really, really robust science. Mm-hmm. And so regardless of where you stand politically on one side or the other about masks or things like that and lockdowns, which I understand both sides of that argument. That said, because people are wedded to both sides of that argument, that it's caused all sorts of consternation about the really good science that's behind the vaccine. And I think it's actually undermined the trust in the vaccine, which I think is really a tragic outcome. And especially because it's, filtering into other vaccines that really, really prevent diseases that kill kids. So I'm hoping that people can get over their political, persuasions to look at the actual science, because that's what matters.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a proxy war for the political issues and the policy issues. It's not that people have really looked at the evidence here. It's just, I need a scientific argument for why you can't force me to get a shot. So
right.
instead of making that argument, you start, with the Bill Gates and the buying up of the farmland and all that, right? That this becomes the new push. Okay, but let's move on. This is actually really interesting, talking here about the possible health risks of marijuana use. And we don't talk about it a lot in the show. So let's get into this. So this story is called Marijuana and Psychosis, Cannabis Use Linked to 30% of Diagnoses in Young Men. And this is a story from Scientific American by Gary Sticks, I believe is the author of this story. It's really interesting. And he's talking about a study that was conducted in Denmark, I want to say. And there's been a lot of really low quality studies on both sides of this issue as well. You have the marijuana advocates who say that it cures glaucoma and it treats pain and gives you wings. It does everything. And then on the other side, you have the drug warriors who think that marijuana is the greatest evil that's ever been invented. And everyone's seen Reefer Madness, So there's you have really entrenched interests on both sides here. But despite all of that, this study is interesting because it is epidemiological. So they weren't able to show for sure that marijuana causes schizophrenia. But they looked at, it looks like it was about 40 years of health records from almost 7 million people. And after doing that analysis, they found that, as the title says, 30% of schizophrenia diagnoses, about 3,000 people in total, could have been prevented in men between 21 and 30. Mm-hmm. They had not smoked so much pot, apparently. So it's interesting, and there's a lot to say here. But again, this is right up your alley. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think that this can be overblown. Mm-hmm. I think that to draw an analogy. Most kids start experimenting with drugs in their late teen years into their 20s, right? And that's when schizophrenia starts to appear. And schizophrenia has it's widely prevalent. I think that people in some estimates say that there's a 1% of the population has schizophrenia. So it is a very common disorder. And I think that there's also, not a great way of there are more than one psychotic disorders. So there's psychotic depression, where you may have hallucinations and things like that. There's full-blown schizophrenia. There's bipolar disorder, where you can have manic episodes where you have so the definition that they're working under of psychosis, I'm not 100% clear on. So what I don't know is if they've because if you look at their table, you see this big bump between the ages of 15 and 25. And that's when, regardless of whether you smoke marijuana or not, schizophrenia tends to show up in that age group. So I'm wondering if you're seeing, just like people are making associations between vaccination and autism starts showing up around 2 to 3 to 4, right when you're getting a vaccine series. So I'm wondering if that's a little bit the same thing. I do think that males tend to be a little bit more prone to schizophrenia than females. I don't know that it's an actual 50-50 balance. I think it's actually leans more heavily towards males. So I think it's a very interesting paper, because I think that what you might be seeing, though, is, drug use happening, and then just unmasking of schizophrenia that's pre-existent in sort of just about to blossom anyway. If you talk about marijuana use, one of the common features that people complain about is in high doses, people get paranoid. And that may be that's also one of the things that you see with schizophrenia, frank paranoia. And so that may be what you're, associating a little bit more with marijuana use or enhancing that. So it might be that they're having a little bit earlier of a break. There were claims like this about LSD, early when LSD was being experimented with, that you would see young, beautiful children who had experimented with LSD and wound up floridly psychotic in different institutions. And I believe that was probably not so much the LSD, but the timing of when people were experimenting with it.
Yeah, it's very difficult to disentangle what's going on here. So there's so many ways to look at the data, and SciEM quotes a couple of experts, and they point out some ways that you can sort of flip this if you wanted to. So one of the points they make is that there was lower reported risk for women in the study. So looking at the same data set, you could say, well, maybe cannabis has a protective effect against schizophrenia, at least in certain subpopulations, right? You can make that argument if you want to, based on these numbers. And again, this is just the loosey-goosey nature of epidemiology. It's nobody's fault, but when you're looking at associations, you can make
to put it like a rock solid claim on something.
Yes, yeah. Couple other things. And again, this points to the possibility that there may be something going on. It may not be schizophrenia, as you said, but there is a condition called cannabis-induced psychosis, I believe is what it's called. I don't know exactly. I believe that's a term. But the potency of marijuana has increased exponentially over the last few years, primarily because of legalization. So people are breeding all of these wackadoodle strains that have really high THC content. That's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. So I believe it's gone up, in Denmark specifically, it's gone up from 13% in 2006 to 30% in 2016.
Which is really potent.
Right. So that's an enormous increase. And you have seen a rise in schizophrenia diagnoses. So the way that they put it is, this is what you would see if there was a causal link between these two. It's not proof that it is, but it suggests that there might be.
And that would be really interesting research to try to, they touched on some of the possibilities, the mechanistic reasons why this might happen, having to do with downregulating the cannabinoid receptor and things like that. But none of that's real clear of exactly what's going on there. And so I suspect that there is a phenotype, which is like a type of person who is more susceptible to certain disorders. And if you give them the little extra push, it tips them over into that realm. So I suspect that's kind of what you're seeing there.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that it would be reasonable to say that too, because you see this with lots of other things. I mean, alcohol is a typical example, right? I drink regularly, but it's in moderation, right? And so nothing comes of that. Now, if you abuse it, lots of stuff goes wrong. But again, it's just a matter of, limiting
What's
how much.
Fascinating about alcohol is some people go through alcohol withdrawal and some people don't. And so there's something different about people's brain receptors when they're going through physical withdrawal. You can have two people who drink an intense amount of alcohol, a huge amount of alcohol, that they qualify as alcoholics. And one of them will stop cold turkey and have no problem, and another will be floridly hallucinating in the ICU with unstable vital signs and things like that. And so it's thought that the way the receptors in their brains react to having a huge amount of alcohol. So if you think about it, we're all on a spectrum between seizing on the one hand and coma on the other hand, and our neurotransmitters in our brains are balancing that. So you've got excitatory neurotransmitters keeping you awake. Those are like glutamate, and inhibitory neurotransmitters that are trying to keep you sleepy. And that's like GABA, right? And so you're on a balance, right? So if you have lots and lots of alcohol, that stimulates the activity of GABA and makes more GABA go. So your brain's going, I'm sleepy, 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 sleepy. I need to reset. And so it downregulates those receptors and upregulates these receptors that will make you more awake. And so if you all of a sudden take away that inhibitory tone from alcohol, now you have unopposed excitation. So you can have seizures and you can have hallucinations and you can have a variety of different things. But it just depends on the individual who's going to react that way. So I suspect that with cannabinoids and marijuana and high doses of marijuana, you're going to see maybe a similar kind of withdrawal syndrome, or, maybe something is happening to the receptors in the brain that different individuals there. We talked about pharmacogenomics last week. This may be a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, just like the horror side of
right.
Yeah, some drugs affect some people worse than others. That's a really good point. And that leads me to recommending this story. This is by another ER physician named Dr. Ronit Lev, and she's writing for the American Council on Science and Health. The article is called Cannabis for Smart Consumers. And the point she's making is not, don't smoke pot or don't eat gummy bears or whatever. If you want to, fine, but just, do it with your head on straight and know what the risks are. And she's talking about some of the things that can go wrong. And she's speaking as someone who's treated people in the ER. And there's all kinds of really goofy things. I mentioned cannabis-induced psychosis, which there is, plenty of research on it. There's multiple studies from Europe that have looked at this, and they find a dose-response relationship. So the more pot someone smokes, the more likely they are to experience this particular psychosis. She also talks about something called, and I may mispronounce this, but she calls it cannabis hyperemesis syndrome.
Hyperemesis syndrome.
Okay. Yeah. So she says that the common symptom is scromiting, which is just screaming and vomiting at the same time. Yeah. Tell people about that.
So they come in and they just vomit. And actually warm showers make it better. And nobody really knows why. But yes, so they'll keep on. It turns into a vicious cycle because they keep on smoking marijuana because that's the only thing that seems to settle it. And then they get into this, and it's actually increased tremendously. And it's a bad problem. It's a bad problem, especially with these, the more potent marijuanas. People sort of think of marijuana smoking as like alcohol, but really actually I think is quite different. And I think that, there was one of my favorite studies. I think this was in Denmark too. I've got to look it up again because it's been years since I talked about it. Was they took Danish soldiers that were in the military that were volunteering to see the effects of marijuana on driving and versus alcohol, if I'm remembering it correctly. And they had them drink vodka and orange juice as screwdrivers, and you saw the expected kind of thing. But with marijuana hash brownies, they actually slowed down their driving, and one of the participants very slowly drove through, I think, 10 red lights. so some people like to say that because marijuana makes you paranoid, you are a more careful driver. I would say you might not be really a more careful driver, you be a little slower driver.
Right. You just do dumb things at a slower pace instead.
That's right.
Go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you. Okay, there's a couple other things here in this art. I'd really just like to get your thoughts on this. So she talks about drug interactions. There's some of these are powerful drugs like Xanax and Zoloft and Lexapro, like for psychological disorders. But she says, and Benadryl, as something as benign as Benadryl, but she says that this high potency marijuana that people are consuming can interact with these drugs, which is a problem. And then she talks about the risk to pregnant women, and there's heart and lung risks because. If you're smoking, you're smoking, right?
This is not just it's funny to me that people are like, oh my goodness, cigarettes, God forbid. But this is all hunky dory. Yes, there's carbon dioxide in there. There are all sorts of toxins when you're smoking marijuana. Yeah,
that's fascinating. Yeah, lighting a leaf on fire and inhaling it, or your lungs are not designed for that sort of an exposure. But that's really interesting. Apparently, also there's risk of seizures for some people that take high dose marijuana. Can you talk about that?
I don't know much about what the mechanism of that is, but what I do know is that there are people who have children with really profound seizures. And I'm trying to remember which category of seizures this is, that actually respond to cannabinoids for moderating their procedures or their seizures.
Is it Dravet syndrome?
That might be it. But these are or maybe Lennox.
Yeah. I was trying to figure out how to pronounce it, but that's the one. Yeah.
So there are some children with refractory seizures that don't respond well to your traditional seizure medicines that seem to have some benefit from cannabinoids. And so, once again, we're all on a spectrum from seizing to coma. So if you've got too much excitatory tone, or you've got scar tissue in your brain that fires, triggers a seizure that then generalizes, usually we turn this off using a benzodiazepine, which is, you mentioned Xanax earlier. That's in that class. Valium's in that class. And what those do, they kind of act like alcohol in that they enhance GABA function, that inhibitory tone in the brain, to try to get things to settle down. But sometimes people are refractory towards that. And in these particular kids, it appears that that they get some benefit from that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And this is just an anecdote, but my experience of marijuana is not good. So I don't use it. There's been just a hand. No. I've used it a couple of times in my life, and it's illegal here in California. So I'm not doing anything illegal, strictly speaking. But I got so high, for 2 days, it was absurd. And I actually interviewed Dr. Lev, and she said, yeah, that's probably one of the more mild symptoms of what psychosis is like. I was like, oh boy.
So you wouldn't want to do it, right?
Yeah. So it's, like you eat fistfuls of goldfish and salami, and that's not terrible necessarily. But when you're walking around 2 days with this goofy high, it's not good. So all that to say, it just seems, the point we're making is that some people respond better than others.
Yeah. Some people like it and some people don't. And I think that also is a reflection of their physiology.
Yeah. Yeah, good stuff. So I like this topic just because the science is developing. For a long time, it seems, I've heard people say at least, that you couldn't openly study the effects of marijuana because it was a Schedule I substance. So it was like the high, manufacturing it at the federal level was a very serious felony.
Exactly.
So people didn't want to study it. So now a lot of this work is being done, and there's these open questions that are being investigated. I just think that's pretty cool. And maybe we can talk about this sometime. I don't know if Genetic Literacy Project does anything on tryptamines, but that's the same thing with LSD and psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and things like that. They are really fascinating. And now people are starting to really look at them. And mechanistically, it makes sense why they would have really profound antidepressive effects. I'm not advocating for people to go drop window painting or anything like that. I am saying it's really interesting science and a fascinating backstory behind it. In fact, LSD comes from a crop pathogen, right? So ergot is a fungal infection of crops, and one of its the chemistries that it makes is lysergic acid. And Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, discovered that LSD. He made a synthetic version of it, and the hippie movement took off, and that comes from a crop infection. So if you don't want to have your Cheerios laced with LSD, it's pretty important to have the things like pesticides, control the insects that transmit the spores from weeds to your crop, because the lysergic acid part of ergot is the mildest thing that happens to you when you have it. So yes, we don't want LSD in our traces, because the micrograms of LSD will really, really make kids trip. Yeah. See how we brought that back around? We went from marijuana to LSD to pesticides, and right, it's all connected, folks. It's all connected. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to leave it there for the week. Thank you for joining us as always. Until we're back next week, follow us on Twitter. I'm at CamJ English, Dr. Liza MD at Dr. Liza MD on Twitter. And I get a lot out of following your Twitter. You retweet interesting stuff. You have interesting commentary. So follow Liza. You'll get a lot out of that. And you can follow me, and I'll just say hi.
And Genetic Literacy Project too.
Yes. At Genetic Literacy, as I'm fond of saying, they put this whole show on for us. They get it on all the platforms, so you guys can listen to it. So give them a follow. They publish all this cool content that we talk about. So with that, have a lovely week, and we will see you for episode 220 next week.
Bye-bye.